Hey, welcome to the Hyatt Institute and this brand new course, 5 lessons that we're sharing with you. And today we have a very, very important lesson called Slavery and the Great Awakening. So, this as a you see the slide there, America's Christian Birth, the Untold Story. That's the name of the course, America's Christian Birth, the Untold Story. 5 lessons. Here are the lessons. I'll just go over with you again so you'll know what is in this course. Lesson 1, the original American vision. Lesson 2, the Great Awakening. Lesson 3, slavery and the Great Awakening. Lesson 4, a nation is born. Lesson 5, America's founding fathers. Every one of these are so very, very important. Today is lesson 3, slavery and the Great Awakening. The textbooks for this course for each class, 1726, America's Revival Heritage. They're both available from Amazon and also from our website at eddiehyatt.com. For this particular lesson, I'm also recommending that you read Abolitionist Founding Fathers with a subtitle, Sin, Slavery, and Redemption at America's Founding. This is such an important lesson because there has been, and it's still going on, a revision of America's history by Marxists, by secularists, by anti-Christian historians who are leaving out all of the Christian elements of our founding and demonizing America's founders as evil people, evil slave owners, and so on. But you're going to get a whole new picture today, and I hope you will share this and share what you learn with others and tell them about this course, tell them about this lesson. Right up front, I want to mention that slavery was not unique to America, but has been practiced by Africans, Asians, Arabs, Europeans, Native Americans, and many other peoples and civilizations throughout recorded history. Slavery is a product of sin, of the fall. It is a horrible thing. But it is a product of the fall that we read about in Genesis 3 when our first parents turned against God, declared their own independence, and went their own egotistical, selfish way, and they opened the door to Satan, to sin, to death, and to all the evil that we see in recorded history and we see in the world today, and slavery was a part of that, an expression of that. The late Dr. Walter E. Williams, he was a professor of economics at George Mason University, but also a very astute historian. He pointed out that although slavery has been practiced by so many peoples and civilizations for all of recorded history, he said the unique characteristic of slavery in America was the moral outrage that arose against it. Yeah, there was something unique about slavery in America, but it was the moral outrage that arose against it. And also, he pointed out the brevity of its existence. That was unique, he said, to slavery in America. Dr. Thomas Sowell, one of the great intellects of our day, of the 20th century in our day, at the time of this recording, he's up in his 90s. He said slavery was just not an issue, not even among intellectuals, much less among political leaders, until the 18th century, and then it was an issue only in Western civilization. Why was that? That's a very important question that we're going to answer in this lesson. He goes on, among those who turned against slavery in the 18th century were George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, and other American leaders. He says you could research all of 18th century Africa or Asia or the Middle East without finding any comparable rejection of slavery there. Again, the question is, why was it happening here? It was happening in Western civilization. It was happening in England. It was happening here in America. Why was it happening here and not in other places? That's an important question that we're going to get an answer to here. The the well-known historians Eugene Genovese and his wife Elizabeth Fox Genovese, they made this statement. They said Europeans, and I included Americans in that, they said did not outdo others in enslaving people or treating slaves viciously. They outdid others by creating a Christian civilization that eventually stirred moral condemnation of slavery and roused mass movements against it. They're right. It was the Christian influence that eventually brought about the end of slavery, beginning in America and in Western civilization. Now, the Great Awakening in America played a primary role in the anti-slavery sentiments, in the moral outrage against slavery that Dr. Walter E. Williams spoke about. It was the Great Awakening that ignited those anti-slavery sentiments. And so I have here on this slide the first generation of awakening preachers, which we talked about in the former lesson, lesson 2. Beginning in 1726, they offered the gospel to everyone, rich and poor, slave and free, black and white. Although slavery existed, there were no segregation laws, and when the Holy Spirit was poured out, racial and cultural walls were broken down, leading the historian Dr. Mark Knoll to say it was under the impulse of the revival that the chasm between white and black cultures were breached. George Whitefield, also, if this sounds familiar, we mentioned this in the former lesson, but it's very important today because I want to show that in the early days of the Great Awakening, starting in 1726, the emphasis was on evangelism, and the emphasis was on evangelizing all people, no matter whether they're rich, poor, slave, or free, because all people are under the power of sin, and there's only one remedy for the situation for all people, Jesus Christ. And so they carried the gospel everywhere, and it broke down cultural and racial barriers. For example, George Whitefield, the most famous evangelist of the Great Awakening, he was delighted to see so many blacks in his audiences. He tells how after delivering his farewell sermon in Philadelphia, where thousands gathered to hear him preach, after delivering his farewell sermon and retiring to his lodging, he said near 50 Negroes came to give me thanks for what God had done for their souls. This shows that blacks and whites were worshiping together there in the 1730s and the 1740s. They were freely worshiping together because the power of this divine awakening had melted differences. Wow. Whitefield also states in his journal that he considered this and answered a prayer, saying, I have been much drawn in prayer for them, and have seen them wrought upon by the word preached. And then Samuel Davies, another evangelist of the Great Awakening, he wrote this in his journal. He said, what little success I have lately had has been chiefly among the extremes of gentlemen and Negroes. Indeed, God has been remarkably working among the latter. I have baptized 150 adults, and at the last sacramental solemnity, I had the pleasure of seeing the table graced with 60 black faces. So we see that the racial and cultural divides are being melted in the power of this Great Awakening. However, after 1750, the second generation of awakening preachers not only called the masses, both black and white, to Jesus, but they began an attack on slavery. Congregationalists, Methodists, and Baptists led the way, leading the historian Benjamin Hart to say, among the most ardent opponents to slavery were ministers, particularly the Puritan and revivalist preachers. Okay, now we're getting to where we're finding the source of this unique moral outrage that arose against slavery in America, but not in other parts of the world. It's this great awakening. It's this Christian awakening that is taking place. Samuel Hopkins pastored for a time in Newport, Rhode Island. Now, he is another awakening preacher. If I remember correctly, he was mentored by Jonathan Edwards. And he pastored for a time in Newport, Rhode Island, an important hub in the slave trade. He was horrified by what he saw, by human beings being treated like commodities on a slave market. He was horrified by what he saw and warned, this whole country have their hands full of blood this day. So the attack on slavery has begun. The awakening preachers now, they're still calling the masses to Jesus. Can never get away from that. But now they're launching an attack on the institution of slavery. Hopkins became a passionate abolitionist, and he delivered a pamphlet to every member of the Continental Congress in which he asked how they could complain about enslavement to Great Britain when so many Africans were enslaved in the colonies. Indeed, this was the question that they began to ask. You talk about liberty. Is it for everyone? Indeed, the abolitionist evangelists began challenging the populace and colonial leaders, asking how they could talk about liberty from Great Britain when so many Africans were enslaved in their midst. John Allen, a Baptist revivalist, he thundered, "Blush, you printed votaries of freedom, you trifling patriots who are making a vain parade of being advocates for the liberties of mankind, who are thus making a mockery of your profession by trampling on the sacred natural rights and privileges of Africans." Yes, the attack on slavery has begun. This is the second generation of awakening preachers who have now taken the awakening another step, still calling the masses to Jesus, but now attacking the institution of slavery. This is what was unique about slavery in America. James O'Kelly, a Methodist revivalist, who was also a passionate abolitionist, he said slavery is a work of the flesh, assisted by the devil, a mystery of iniquity that works like witchcraft to darken your understanding and harden your hearts against conviction. Yeah, the attack on slavery has begun. Freeborn Garrison, another awakening preacher. Freeborn was from Maryland, and he was a slave owner, but he heard the Holy Spirit. He said he heard the Holy Spirit speak supernaturally to him and say to him, "It is not right for you to keep your fellow creatures in bondage." Freeborn then told his slaves that they did not belong to him, and if they wanted to stay with him, he was going to have to pay them an appropriate salary. He freed his slaves, and he became a powerful revivalist and a passionate abolitionist. You see, the two now have merged. The awakening preachers and an abolition movement, they are leading the way in this 18th century abolition movement. Freeborn traveled not only in the North, he traveled also in the South, stopping at plantations and asking permission to preach to the slaves. While there, he would seek to convince the slaveholders that slavery is a sin and abomination in the sight of God. He got lots of opposition, especially in the South, but he also saw tremendous fruit. Just one example of the opposition, he tells about a slave owner came to the house where he was staying, and this person had heard about what he was preaching and came in and began to argue with him and punched him in the face. So Freeborn did not retaliate, but neither did he flinch or withdraw. He continued to face the man and tell him why slavery was an abomination in the sight of God, and the man finally turned and left. So he was very determined in his preaching and in his abolitionist stance. Um, he visited the Stokely Sturgis plantation in Delaware. He preached to both the slaves and the slave owners, and he was able to convince Sturgis, the slave owner, that slavery is a sin. So Sturgis then began making arrangements for his slaves to go free. One of those who obtained his freedom was Richard Allen. Now, Richard Allen has been called America's black founding father. You see his dates there, 1760, 1831. Upon obtaining his freedom, he began doing what was burning in his heart. You see, he had become converted sometime before by a Methodist preacher who came to the plantation and preached the gospel, and he had come to Christ. So he was already a believer when Freeborn Garrison came. It kind of reminds me of what Paul said. He said, I've planted and another watered. And some Methodist preacher came, called the slaves to Christ. Richard Allen became one of them. And then later, Freeborn Garrison comes along, waters the seed, and then tells the slave owner that slavery is an abomination in the sight of God. He changes his heart, and the slaves find their freedom. So, and upon obtaining his freedom, Allen began doing what was burning in his heart, preaching the gospel. He was a very powerful preacher, and he preached to interracial audiences with great success and did much to further breach the racial and cultural barriers in America. With the assistance of the founding father, Dr. Benjamin Rush, and we'll hear more about him in another lesson, Allen founded Bethel Church in Philadelphia, out of which came the African Methodist Episcopal Church. As a result of this awakening, it's still colonial America. America's not been founded, but everyone is being impacted. It's a powerful movement. And America's founding fathers are impacted. As a result of the Great Awakening and the anti-slavery sentiments it ignited, it seemed that every founding father, even those who owned slaves, took a public stand against it. George Washington, for example, wrote, "There is not a man living who wishes more than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." And some might say, well, why couldn't they just abolish it and let everybody go free? Well, it wasn't that easy. Slavery had become entangled in the culture and the economy of the South. Also, the people were illiterate. They had not been prepared for freedom. And so it wasn't really feasible to just suddenly release all the slaves. And probably there was still so much opposition in the South, it probably would have caused a war. But George Washington, he says, "There is not a man living who wishes more than I do to see a plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." But then he set in motion a plan in his own plantation for this. He made arrangements for his slaves to go free. If they wanted to stay, they would receive a salary. They would receive remuneration for their work. He also began a program of educating the children of slaves for freedom. And he stated, "I clearly foresee that nothing but the rooting out of slavery can perpetuate the existence of our union by consolidating it in a common bond of principle." Benjamin Franklin, he was impacted by this awakening. He freed his 2 slaves and joined the Abolition Society of Philadelphia and served as its president. He stated, "Slavery is an atrocious debasement of human nature and a source of serious evils." John Adams, he was never a slave owner. And he stated every measure of prudence ought to be assumed for the eventual total expiration of slavery from America. I have throughout my whole life held the practice of slavery in abhorrence. Benjamin Rush, this founding father, helped found the first abolition society in America in his hometown of Philadelphia. By the way, he was a physician in Philadelphia. He served as the Surgeon General at the request of George Washington in the American Revolutionary Army. Benjamin Rush, he called on pastors. He was a devout Christian, by the way. He called on pastors to oppose slavery, saying, "But chiefly, you ministers of the gospel, let your zeal keep pace with your opportunities to put a stop to slavery. Slavery is a hydra sin and includes in it every violation of the precepts of the law and the gospels." We alluded to this a little bit earlier. Rush became close friends with Richard Allen because Richard Allen eventually settled in Philadelphia. They became close friends, and Allen assisted him in forming Bethel Church, out of which came the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And there's more detail to their friendship and the founding of this Bethel Church, out of which became one of America's great black denominations. There's more to that in a later lesson. I think it's probably in lesson 5 on the founding fathers that you'll hear more details about their friendship. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Now, because of this great awakening and the moral outrage that now has arisen and is spreading throughout colonial America, because this founding document states that all men are created equal, and also it contains no classifications based on race or skin color, many considered it to be a statement against slavery. And abolitionists used it in their fight to abolish slavery. And in fact, it was a statement against slavery. I have been able to look at some of the drafts. You know, there was a committee of 5, that, including Benjamin Franklin, that was going to assist Thomas Jefferson in writing this Declaration of Independence. So it wasn't like he just sat down one day and wrote it up. No, they wrote drafts, they looked it over, they discussed it, they made edits, they made changes. And in looking at especially one of the drafts leading up to this, it's obvious that they were making a statement, not only for liberty, but liberty for all people, of this statement against slavery. And so it's not surprising that abolitionists begin to use the Declaration of Independence in their fight against slavery. For example, at a gathering of Methodist leaders in Baltimore in 1784, they issued a statement denouncing slavery as contrary to the golden rule of God. What's the golden rule of God? Treat others the way you want to be treated. Love your neighbor as yourself. They said slavery is contrary to the golden rule of God, the unalienable rights of mankind, and every principle of the revolution. So they're quoting from the Declaration, the unalienable rights of mankind and every principle of the revolution. So they're using the Declaration of Independence to support their denouncement of slavery. Wow. Frederick Douglass, the famous former slave and abolitionist, no one was more scathing in their attacks on slavery and slave owners and those who tried to justify slavery. No one was more scathing than Frederick Douglass. But listen to what Frederick Douglass said about the Declaration of Independence. He said, "The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in all places, against all foes, and at whatever cost." Well, and then Thomas Jefferson. Now, here's something I want you to know about this statement. Yeah, Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner, but he obviously took a stand against slavery. And he made this statement in light of the fact that after the United States was formed, slavery was still in existence in the South. And he made this statement about this. It was like a warning, a concern, and a warning. He said, God who gave us life gave us liberty. And can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis? A conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are a gift from God, that they are not to be violated, but with his wrath. He's talking about the fact, hey, slavery is still in existence in this nation. They are not to be allowed. This gift of liberty is not to be violated, but with his wrath. He says, indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice cannot sleep forever. There were others who made similar statements of warnings. And many believe that the Civil War, with its hundreds of thousands of deaths on American soil, was the judgment that Jefferson and others warned about. But you see, there is this moral outrage. This is a part of the moral outrage that has arisen against slavery that was unique to America in its founding. Patrick Henry, he said, slavery is a lamentable evil as repugnant to humanity as it is consistent with the Bible and destructive of liberty. But after making this statement, Patrick Henry confessed his sin. This was in a letter, by the way. These statements were in a letter to a Quaker abolitionist who had written a letter to Patrick Henry. And Henry made this statement how that slavery is a lamentable evil and so on. But then he confessed his sin. He said, would anyone believe I am the master of slaves of my own purchase? I am drawn along by the general inconvenience of living here without them. So we could say that Henry was hypocritical. And that is true. But the positive thing about this is he is no longer seeking to justify slavery. He is admitting that it is a lamentable evil in the sight of God. It is sinful. He is no longer seeking to justify it. This anti-slavery movement is having a powerful impact in changing the minds and the thinkings of even those who became the founding fathers. A reminder of those two historians, Eugene Genovese and Elizabeth Fox Genovese. Their statement makes even more sense to us now as we've gone through this. They said Europeans and Americans did not outdo others in enslaving people or treating slaves viciously. They outdid others by creating a Christian civilization that eventually stirred moral condemnation of slavery and roused mass movements against it. My friends, don't let anybody tell you anything different. It was Christianity. It was the influence of Christianity. It was a Christian awakening that brought about the end of slavery in America and in Europe. Because of the Great Awakening, America's founders were on the cutting edge of the fight to end slavery at a time it was accepted and practiced in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and most of the world. There is a movement out to demonize America's founders, to remove their names from schools, to topple their statues. But these people are not aware of history. They have been brainwashed by a Marxist, anti-Christian, anti-American ideology. And folks, we need to get out the truth. For as Jesus said, it is a truth that will set us free. And the truth is that America's founders, because of the Great Awakening, they were on the cutting edge of the fight to end slavery at a time it was accepted and practiced in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and most of the world. Because of the Great Awakening, America's founding documents, including the U.S. Constitution that came along in 1787, America's founding documents contain no classifications based on race or skin color and do not mention slaves or slavery. Dr. Thomas Sowell, we now understand his statement. He said, you could research all of 18th century Africa or Asia or the Middle East without finding any comparable rejection of slavery there. Why did it happen here? It happened because of a great awakening that brought about a Christian influence of living according to the golden rule, to love God with all of your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself, and to treat others the way you want to be treated. That was what brought about this anti-slavery movement in America at a time it was accepted and practiced all around the world. This is a picture of the Liberty Bell, and here are the words that are printed on the Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land. And that's from the book of Leviticus. Don't hold me to this, but I think I should have put the quote there, but I think it's Leviticus 25:10. And it's related to the year of Jubilee. But it's a wonderful passage. And it was the early Americans felt it was appropriate to their lives and to the new nation. Proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. So America became defined not by 1619 and slavery. The 1619 Project, which was brought forth by the New York Times and has been made into a curriculum that is now being taught, sadly, in Christian schools throughout America, and children are being taught to despise and hate America. It says that America was defined by 1619 when the first African slaves were brought to this land, and therefore America is racist at its very core and corrupt and in need of fundamental change. Yes, these are the Marxists who want you to believe that America is defined. That's who we are. No. America became defined. That could have happened if it had not been for 1726. But America became defined by 1726 and the Great Awakening. This awakening caused the faith of the founding generation to flourish and fanned into flame the desire for liberty for all of her inhabitants. Hallelujah. And so we need to pray that America will be revived, that this true vision, this founding vision for liberty, and this great awakening that not only had a direct bearing on the founding of America, but had a direct bearing on the ending of slavery on this continent, that this truth will be spread far and wide. So I hope that you will take this truth and that you will proclaim it everywhere, to your social medias, to the people where you have influence. Share it with your pastors, share it with teachers and professors, and let's get the truth out about America's Christian birth. At this time, it's an untold story, but we are retelling it and making it known. I'm Eddie Hyatt, and I'm so glad that you've joined me for this lesson on slavery and the Great Awakening, and there's contact information there that you can see if you want to be in contact with Sue and myself. And all of that contact information and more is at my website, eddiehyatt.com. And I'll look forward to seeing you for lesson number 4 and lesson number 5.